Good evening and welcome to Dusty Feet. I love that shofar. I do. I love it. Okay, so tonight we have part 2 of 2 takes on the test at Mount Sinai. We'll continue our Mackie, Collins, Imes discussion. I think Tim, John, and Carmen have quite a bit going on, and I think we're going to have some fun unpacking some things tonight that'll challenge us, which I enjoy unpacking these kind of things. So don't forget, in the description below are links to all the video, audio, and source documents that we use here on the Dusty Feet. We want to make sure that any material we use here is properly credited to those folks who work so hard to bring it to us. Without their efforts, the learning we do here does not happen. So be sure to click to subscribe. And as always on the Dusty Feet, this is a place where we can safely explore the endless ways of God and the interconnection of His creation, where belief understandings may be challenged, divine misunderstandings may exist, and traditional teachings might falter as we pursue connection, context, and community with God and each other here in an environment of grace and love. So here we go with more Bible Project on the Dusty Feet. Okay, so tonight should be fun. Might be a bit of a roller coaster ride for some. So, but that's what you get sometimes on this show. So buckle your seatbelts. However, just like a roller coaster, I encourage you, pick your arms up in the air. Enjoy the ride. We'll talk about it when we all get off and get our slushies, right? So let's take a listen to the continuation with Tim, John, and Carmen talking about the 2 takes on the test at Mount Sinai.
John, I'm curious, at this point, where you're watching 2 people who have dedicated a lot of time to understanding these, and all of a sudden there's more than one way to read these texts, what does that feel like for you? In this moment? Maybe it's energizing for you. I don't know.
Actually, it's a little frustrating. But yeah, I think, well, I mean, I spend so much time with you, so I just get inside of your brain. And so I could get really comfortable and just being like, oh yeah, this is great. There's a nice, coherent way to view all of this. So it's a little jarring to kind of go, oh, that's how you read that story? Or there is a compelling case to be made to read that story in that way. But I think that's just my initial reaction. And then also I can hear Tim's response being like, ooh, I want to engage. I want to kind of hear that argument and through. I'm like, okay, I'm going to let Tim hear that argument through because I don't know if I have the brain space. But I think what is cool is for me to be able to engage with these ideas on the level of narrative patterning, and just having that perspective and tool set is nice. I will say I'm very empathetic to the reading that we've been having, so it's kind of hard for me to detach from it and try to completely understand how the test from Abraham would be. Second guess me. I mean, that's interesting.
It's like an invitation to wrestle with God, and Abraham doesn't take the bait. Yeah. Like he doesn't wrestle.
Yeah. It's what Moses does.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. On the golden calf story.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's interesting.
I'm thinking of the Jewish meditation literature video in the How to Read the Bible series, and just how you guys have laid it out as like, this is complicated. And there are all these resonances, and it's going to take us a lifetime to sit with these and wrestle with them. You know, the complexity means we just can't wrap our minds around it and be done. Like, check it off the list. I just also want to say that I'm still in the early stages of actually writing my commentary. So I haven't worked in depth on that question.
Yeah.
Like I quickly turned to Mike Kibbe's dissertation to help me answer it because I knew he had sat with that question for a long time.
Yeah.
But I haven't worked my way all the way to that point of my commentary. Yeah. So I may listen to your explanation of it and be persuaded by that.
Yeah.
I have a thought. Can I jump in?
Yeah.
It seems like these two interpretations cash out in pretty different ways. And they're both really cool ways. One is where we took our video on the test, which is a test is an opportunity to trust God, even though it doesn't make sense. And we have this image at the end of the video where there's this flaming door. And you're like, I'm not going to walk through that flaming door. But then an arm comes out, to lead you through it. And you picture Moses going up the top of Sinai, and it looks like he's going into his death. I mean, that's what Israel sees. But through the flaming door into the space where God and him can be together. And so it's this picture of, can I trust God even though I have this sense of self-preservation that's telling me not to? Or I'm second guessing God's wisdom based off of my own assessment of what I need. That's a cool thing to think about.
It is.
The other way to think about this that you're suggesting is the opportunity that we have as God's human partners to engage with him. And we see that with Abraham as he negotiates about Sodom and Gomorrah. We see it with Moses negotiating on behalf of Israel. And that's a cool thing to think about, that we actually we're invited to participate in actually actively negotiating with God. And those are kind of two completely different, they almost feel opposed to each other in some way. Like, just trust God even though it doesn't make sense. There's something beautiful there. I think there's something biblical there. Or here's an opportunity to engage with God and almost second guess God in a way, because he wants to actually engage with you as a partner.
I think the key that unites those two beautiful approaches is the character of God. We can trust God blindly because we trust his character. When something looks like it's not lined up with the character of the Yahweh we know, that's where we would be invited to wrestle. This is what you see, say, in Psalm 89, where the psalmist is saying, look at all these great promises you made to David to have a king on the throne. And then halfway through the psalm, it's this, where are you? You don't seem to be upholding David as king the way you said you were going to. So there's a disjunction between what God says or what he promises and what we're observing in life. And I think we can trust God that he's going to work out his purposes, but I think he invites us to engage with him like that.
When we get to the part of the narrative where Moses is on top of the mountain for 40 days with God, there's this sense of perhaps that should have been all of Israel up there with God in the Eden space. Or are you pretty comfortable kind of going, no, that's great. That's the ideal. Like, Israel up there would have been a mess, like, in some way. And they needed a mediator. And that the ideal was the mediator goes up there.
I think they needed a mediator. I think it would have been a mess because they hadn't been made holy yet. And so they needed a mediator because they didn't have a tabernacle yet and they didn't have a priesthood. And so therefore there was not an operational sacrificial system that would repair that relationship so that they could safely be in God's presence. So I actually think what resulted was even better than if they had gone up the mountain. God said, no, I'm going to come move down into your neighborhood. I'm coming down to where you are. But the tabernacle facilitated that move so that they could safely be in the presence of God.
Yeah. Yeah, I think for me, this raises the whole set of questions about, well, I already named it, how when later stories are patterned after earlier ones. So for example, the establishment of the fire and the angels at the boundary of Eden, and you can't go back in. But the whole narrative is like, but I wish somebody could go back in. Like, we need somebody to go back in. And wouldn't that be great if it was everybody? And so then you start having these narrative patterns of people, characters facing these life and death decisions, or maybe life and death for the next generation, where they stand at that door, as it were, and whether or not they're going to trust and step towards what looks like death and then discover that it's actual real life. And that was that's the force or the pressure that the Eden story was exerting on me all through Genesis, leading me up to be inclined to see that same dynamic here. Namely, that the ideal would be for all the people to be re-entered back to Eden. But what happens is the people stay distant. And I do think there's something to the macro design, how the moment where the people say, we don't want to go, or they say that they stand far away and push Moses up. And Moses says, this is a test. That's in chapter 20, verses 18 and following. That's at the literary center of all of 19 through 24. So there's something there that is really highlighting that moment that they want to be distant, and Moses is the one who goes up. The pressure of the earlier patterns is what led me to see that as another concession, as it were. And so it's good that we have one, because if we have one, God can work with that one on behalf of all of the others. But it does point still to a lost ideal.
But even that one ends up not being able to go into the tabernacle at the end of Exodus, right?
Yes.
In the literary design, this is what your Exodus video brings out so well. There's like this unfinished element. And I think that's setting us up for why we need Leviticus. We don't have a priesthood yet. We don't know the sacrifices yet. And that's going to be necessary if we're going to re-enter God's presence. I think it's the mercy of God, isn't it? That he drives Adam and Eve out of the garden because he doesn't want them to eat from the tree of life and live forever in that state, state of brokenness. So the people aren't ready yet to approach the tree of life until that healing happens.
Yeah, I appreciate that.
Okay. So let's chew on some of those things. This I like. Okay. So a question posed to John about two individuals exchanging ideas about the text and how do you really feel about it? This is a very good question to ask. It's probably a very important question to ask. Not only to ourselves, but to those that we chat with as well. It is. We'll get back to that point at the very, very end. Not of this one, but at the end to this particular discussion. So John says it was a little frustrating. He's also comfortable with the way Tim thinks and how he views things. And it was a bit jarring to hear someone else have a compelling counterthought. His point was that he was not sure if he was ready to engage in the argument being made, but tethered, then he could let Tim engage, and Tim is indeed very comfortable with that. John's along for the ride, right? So how do we engage with those challenging topics? Do we kind of pull back and see, or not see, for that matter, or do we engage and see if there's more? And can we be comfortable with those of a differing thought and still engage and interact? Can we still engage in community activities? We'll get back to that at the end of this discussion as well. What was cool was to engage with this topic under the understanding of narrative patterning. So there's still a common thought process, and that patterning is very much a part. As in many patterns, if they are repetitive, then what might that look like? Is it really part of a larger pattern, or might it be part of another or different pattern, especially in the other elements in the story, right? And maybe as an inverse pattern, right? Raised instead of inset, dark instead of light, negative instead of positive. So how do the elements in a repetitive pattern, as in the story that's being played out here, interact with that story, as in the Abraham test with Isaac? I personally had the same view as Carmen Imes, right? that Abraham failed the test, that the elements that play out afterwards might also support that position. Isaac and such were a hot mess after that. Go figure why. Really? When we get empathetic with a position, sometimes a bit comfortable, right? Then what defenses do we start to rise when that comfort is pressed on? How comfortable are you with an invitation to wrestle with God? Is that only reserved for a few? Is it safe to do such? Prophets often wrestle with God. Jonah is a very vivid story of that. Job and his responses to God goes the same direction. What I tend to lean towards is, can we have an interactive relationship with God? The gods of antiquity were all ones that folks only tried to appease, and at best, not anger. Our God has no interest in appeasement, doing things just to try to keep him happy and not mad at us. Our God wants a relationship. He wants an interacting, caring, loving relationship. One based on respect, healthy fear, and the other love. There is no other God like this. He truly is a set apart, holy, unique God, holy in not like others, and he deserves the recognition as the creator of all, right? Carmen brings up a point that Tim and John make in this Jewish meditation literature vids that we talk about, and we cover them here. And she reiterates that the literature is complicated. It's full of resonances, and it might take us a lifetime to seek that all out, right? It's okay to wrestle with complexity, especially if it changes our current views. John brings up points that these two lines of thought seem to cash out fairly differently. Both, he thought, were pretty cool ways, in John's words. One, that a test is an opportunity to trust God even though it doesn't make sense. I guess a safe question: what are the differences between, one, not making sense, and two, not understanding or seeing how it will play out? Okay. Those are two very challenging points to muddle through, just on their own. So those are good ones. And how can we be sure that what we really want or are doing is really what God wants? Is that second guessing God? I'm not sure. Then there's the invitation or opportunity to interact with God, to wrestle with God. Yet maybe if we view this as a combined approach where it is listening to God, and that's up for discussion and discernment for sure, and then putting those thoughts, ideas, plans up against the character of God. Do they fit in his character? So in the Abraham story, for example, we have a healthy fear and a wanting to listen to God, and yet the act he is being challenged with is outside the character of God. Remember, we talked about God being unique and set apart, holy, right, from other gods. With other gods, there were child sacrifices to appease the gods. The opportunity with Abraham is to take him to that next level of understanding with God. It was for him to push back with God. This is not you. You are not this kind of God. He did negotiate with Sodom and Gomorrah, right? And he interacted with God. He challenged him there. He wanted to push him more, right? So how does that fit with you, right? How comfortable are you with that? I'd be willing to bet with many that can be a bit frightening, at least unnerving, right? I believe that God does not want blind faith. I do very much believe that he wants trusting faith. I think there's a difference. Trusting is based on what I see and understand, that I have the confidence that the possible eventual outcome will come to pass, even though I can't see how. Okay? So again, let's use Abraham as the example. Okay? His actions are really quite understandable here, right? When God says that he will have so many dependents, right? That they're grains of sand is the best way to describe their numbers. And since Abraham has no children and Sarah has not been able to produce children, the logical cultural choice was to use a handmaiden as a surrogate. It's common practice in that culture. We see it often in scripture, and it's even addressed in Torah. Abraham could not see how it could work. That's not blind faith, but in this point, he's not trusting. As in, okay, God, not sure how that's going to happen, but I'll leave that part to you. Okay. In our men's group, we were going through Luke, and we came across the story of Zechariah and Elizabeth, parents to John the Baptist, right? The herald to the Messiah and future king. Zechariah does not see how that's going to happen, since he and Elizabeth are childless and they're getting along in years, right? And this irritates the messenger, trusting God to do his part, right? And he makes it mute. I guess he pretty quickly learned sign language and charades to become his second language. Not sure they had Post-it notes and pencils laying around back then, right? So the story adds a different element to the pattern. He goes home after he completes his service in the temple, and then he does his part and Elizabeth conceives, right? So maybe it was faith, and maybe it was a bit of, okay, let's see what happens, because it hadn't so far. Now, Elizabeth, she has a very different view of why she conceived. In her view, it is God taking away her, quote, reproach among men, the shame of not bearing children. It is not until after the birth and the naming that all the stories made clear, right? Maybe Zechariah, as a priest especially, should have recognized the same story or related with Abraham and the messenger. Maybe it's still hard to be in the story while you're trying to see the relationship to another story. Forest for the trees? None of that is blind, but it is trusting God to do his part. That is a promise in his character. Killing humans for sacrifice, appeasement, not part of his character. It was for the Canaanite and Moabite gods. Yes, blind faith and trusting faith do have a tension between them, almost opposed in a way, and that will have to be worked out. I believe character is the key element in discerning through that. God's character. Then Tim mentions a point in the narrative patterns about the cherubim and the flaming swords and blocking the entrance to the garden and also to the ark. I probably have a different and probably upside down view of a few things that I thought I might share for thought and discussion. I'll premise this with a few things to set this in motion. Many will probably disagree with me on some of the points. We'll see. One, I am not a literalist in relation to the creation story as such, meaning to me, it was not a literal 7 days. The described cosmology is the understanding of the early Mesopotamian culture, and Adam and Eve were not the only humans on the earth. See the Cain and Abel story for details there. Okay. That said, let's point out a few things. Yes, there was a land of Eden. Geographical landmarks are part of the narrative. And within that land is the Garden of Eden. In Mesopotamian culture, it was very much the practice of kings and royalty to build elaborate gardens in the cities in which they dwelled. Gardens privy to the kings and rulers and an elect few. In this light, we see God's chosen in his garden. We see them as the archetypes of those priests to serve God and the people. God gives them instructions. And if we leave them alone, then leave them alone in the story, then maybe we miss the point that they possibly should have shared those instructions with others, shared God's ways. So they, Adam and Eve, are removed from the garden, and the garden's locked and protected. Carmen even brings up a point that it was mercy to remove them, since things would be very different if they were tree of life, eternal recipients, right? The interactions and the verbiage used, thank you, Skip Moen, for this study, is very dysfunctional with Adam and Eve and everything that follows after that. And the verbiage used by Cain, that he was worried that since he'd been banished from the area that he was in, if he traveled, he had fears for his life in those cities that surrounded. Cities, that would be Pepples around there. So question I had is, how would they know that he had actually caused the death of Abel, but yet they all knew that his parents were the ones in the garden and that they, living outside in the land, were subject to the consequences of those priestly people, as we all are. The actions of the parents being a large influence on their children's actions and their interactions with God and others. Instructions, obedience, walking with God. Just something to think about over a cup of coffee or tea. Okay? Chew on that. So with that, let's take a crack at packet 2 that we have in tonight's episode on this.
Good. I need to think about these things more.
We need to make a cup of coffee and go for a walk.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yep. The problem is, I don't want to wait till I'm 98 to say anything about the Bible. And so there's nothing for it, though, to just say, this is my current understanding, and I might actually land at the same place, but with greater conviction, or I might adapt my views along the way, and likely both will happen many times over.
And isn't it a beautiful thing that we can sharpen each other and trade ideas? Like, isn't this what the rabbis did as they read scripture together? And well, it could be this and it could be this. And somehow they were able to sit with more unresolved tensions than we are. We want to know, like, well, which is it?
Yeah. That's
Seems like there's maybe more room for ambiguity there.
Yeah. Let's transition to a couple other questions that we had for you. The first one, I think I know, but I haven't heard you quite speak to it. So I was curious because you brought up the tabernacle, setting up the tabernacle as a place where the relationship can be healed. So the tabernacle is full of garden-like imagery in its description.
Mm-hmm.
People have interpreted that symbolism in different ways, however, over time. So, and that is going to lead to another question about the dress and the role of the high priest within that place. So maybe first, what do you make of the tabernacle garden imagery within the larger storyline of the Torah?
Yeah, I think it's unmistakable that there's all this garden imagery. I have an article about it where I sort of assembled all of the different
Oh, you do? It's published?
echoes. Yeah, so it's in the Festschrift for John Walton, For Us, But Not To Us. Huh. And the article's titled The Lost World of the Exodus. So I kind of take Walton's style of Lost World books, and I apply it to seeing Exodus as a creation story. And in so many ways, the book of Exodus is a creation story, the creation of the nation of Israel. And so I think that the Tabernacle chapters echo the creation event because it's finally bringing them to the place where they can dwell in the presence of God, as Adam and Eve dwelt in God's presence in the garden. So many things. God consecrates the seventh day of creation. He consecrates the tabernacle. There's cherubim guarding the way to the tree of life. There's cherubim in the inner sanctuary of the tabernacle. There's a tree of life in the garden. There's a tree-shaped candelabra in the sanctuary. There's gold and onyx in the Garden of Eden. There's gold and onyx on the high priest garments, and in the tabernacle, the other furniture has gold. The creation days go from evening to morning, and evening and morning the first day, and evening and morning the second day. And the lamps in the tabernacle are lit from evening to morning. So many echoes between the two. There's all these sevens in both stories, right? We have 7 days of Genesis 1, but we have God issues the tabernacle instructions on Moses' 7th day on the mountain. So he waits 6 days and then he hears them on the 7th day. We hear that in chapter 24. The priest's ordination ceremony spans 7 days, and then they're clothed with new garments, just like Adam and Eve are clothed in the garden. The ordination has 7 days of atonement on the altar, and the 7-day ceremony is repeated for Aaron's successors. At the very end of the tabernacle instructions, the last thing we're told is that they should keep the Sabbath. So the instructions are happening on the 7th day, and we hear about the tabernacle, and then we get Sabbath last. And it's the Sabbath instructions are the 7th of speeches. So we're on the 7th day, and there's 7 speeches about the tabernacle, and the last one's about the Sabbath. I mean, it just seems like it's everywhere through this story. Like it's very Eden focused.
All right. That's a very compact list. Okay. So all of that being the case, what do we make of just kind of these 3 sections that the Exodus story lays out then? So Moses sees all of this. He's shown what you just described up on the mountain, and he sees a high priestly, figure and description and what it all looks like. So that's what he sees. Then the next narrative after those 7 speeches conclude is the guy who's supposed to be wearing those clothes. The camera shifts down to Aaron, who is not only not being somebody who's ready for that kind of role, but he's making an image of a golden calf. And then you get the image, but Moses is the one up on the mountain, and he's actually being the mediator, and he starts shining while he's up there mediating. And so you have this ideal priest, the guy who's supposed to fill the role, who's like not fit for the job. And then you have his younger brother, who's actually seems to be doing the thing of what his Aaron should be doing on a good day. So what do you make of that juxtaposition of roles and failed figures, but the wrong person doing the right thing? What do you think is going on there?
Yeah. Moses is clearly exalted. Like he clearly has an exalted role over Aaron. And we see this again and again. In the priestly ordination ceremony in Leviticus, Moses does all the things, and Aaron is passive. Moses washes him. Moses dresses him. Moses does the sacrifices. Moses puts the stuff in Aaron's hands. So it really, we see Moses as a strong actor. He's the prophet. He's the one authorized to lead. Aaron is an interesting figure, and I need to spend more time thinking about it, but he's a model for every Israelite, but he's almost like mute. Aaron doesn't say anything except the blessing, the priestly blessing that we see in Numbers 6. He doesn't even dress himself. I have an article about Aaron's garments, his high priestly garments, in which I talk about the clothes make the man. So Aaron actually has no special qualifications, skill-wise. He just when he puts these clothes on and these things are done to him, he is able to perform his role. And I wonder if part of what we're seeing in the golden calf story is that God is going to take a very ordinary, flawed human being, and that the ordination ceremony and the clothing is going to transform him so that he can be put in God's service, the same way the whole nation is flawed as a kingdom of priests. And God takes them as they are and transforms them to be his representatives. Aaron's interesting because he's not autonomous. He has no authority outside his office. You know, in the book of Numbers, when there's that brush up between Aaron and Miriam and Moses, and they're complaining about Moses because, well, we're prophets too. Like, you know, what's so fascinating about that is Miriam gets leprosy or lepra, however we translate that. And Aaron is powerless to do anything about it. Yeah. And he has to come to Moses and say, will you pray for her? Yeah. Because priests actually don't cure skin diseases. They just let you know if they are cured. And so Moses' authority is so much greater. He's not just one of them with access to God. Like he has a different level of access than Aaron does. And it's consistent through his life.
Okay. So.
Right there we go. Thank you. Okay. So one of the things I noticed in many discussions with priests and priestly duty is that we often scramble the roles of each and the focus of each. Okay. I don't see anywhere in Scripture where one, everyone is supposed to be a priest, and two, all has the same access to certain space. Separate those two. Again, in the beginning, there was a priestly area, a garden, selected, appointed people. In the tabernacle, later in the temple, there were areas for the high priest, then areas for other priests, and the area for the people, those being served, us others. There have been many repetitive patterns of select individuals to intercede on our behalf or on the behalf of others in Scripture, right? The imagery of the garden in the tabernacle is very, very much evident indeed. Totally agree. And yet only a few select priests and the high priest would see those items and that imagery. We're just getting the story afterwards. We get to peek in. But this is not a museum, nor an attraction where people wander around like we do today when we have recreations of these spaces. This was only for a select few. Those representing God to the people, serving the people, and in the role of the high priest, interacting with God on our behalf. Yes, Yeshua is our high priest. See duties in Exodus to elaborate, and he is our king. See David for ideas of such. I think we tend to have a very stoic view of Yeshua and a very focused and serious teacher. I personally choose to have a different view of Yeshua. I can see him akin to David, walking and leaping and praising his Father, leading the procession with those cool praises and songs, writing music for all of us to enjoy in a new way. A joyous high priest who speaks for creation on our behalf to God as intercessor. He can truly be that role as it could have been. A smiling, caring, emotional leader who cares deeply about his people and all of his Father's creations. We are not high priests and don't have those duties or responsibilities. And sometimes I think we tend to forget that. We do have roles as priests, and we just seem to forget that primarily this is a service role to the people in our time to the nations. Not to isolate, but to intercede and represent. Let's not mash everything up into one. Believe me, there's plenty to do for everyone, right? I really didn't realize, till Carmen mentions it, is how passive Aaron's role is in preparation. And that Moses really, the interaction was really did the action in the event. Some thoughts I'll have to chew on, see for sure, because this is somebody with no real skill or background. He's just chosen and expected to do the task, and his family and his descendants to follow, right? The luck of birth. But as we see, it's still a role that each must still embrace and take seriously from the get-go. And if they don't, see Aaron's son's story for details. Okay? Remember, Aaron has no idea that God has selected him to be the high priest when the golden calf incident happens. He does not know what and who he will be or his descendants. Yes, I agree with Carmen. God will transform this broken man. Are we really any different? And use the garments to help him in his role. And remember, these are active garments and they do things. Really cool. Read the text. It also hit me, the priests had no authoritative power, right? No power in and of themselves. And that the Miriam incident showed that there was more to the Moses role that was not high priest, which really broached an interesting point and maybe subsequent question. Do we really all have equal access to God? Really ponder that. Not the doctrine or teaching or positions that stories tell. That are their duties and roles that God has need to interact with and on a different level. The question of the role of the priesthood. The priesthood. Let's not confuse that with the role of the high priest. They're very related, but very different. We continue to mash those two together instead of seeing the roles and the importance of each. Priesthood, very real. We are a part. And I guess the question that begs to be asked, are we ready to be one, not the high priest, but a serving priest? And maybe a brutal question to ourselves as well. Are we failed intercessors as well? Brutal, yeah? Okay, so let's take a quick listen to the next section.
How does that difference between the two brothers and the ideal role, how should that affect how we think about the role of the priesthood, not in the history of Israel, but how the biblical authors want us to view the role of the priesthood? It's a good thing that there is this mediator, but at the same time, the first character to ever fill the role, it's like the volume is turned up on his failure. And the same will happen with the only other main priest highlighted, which is Eli and his sons, and they're just as much of failures as Aaron. So there's something, I think, very significant about that, about the portrayal of this priesthood, contrasted with Moses. What do you think those overall implications are for how we think about the Hebrew Bible's message about the Aaronic priesthood?
Yeah, it is a very, I feel like the stories are fascinating because they're showing us the priests at the same time issuing a strong warning against any kind of innovation or any kind of syncretism. So the priests they never become their own thing. They can't run the show. In fact, the very first story we have about priests after the priestly ordination in Leviticus 8 and 9 is the story of Nadab and Abihu. Like first day after this thing is up and running, we hear about Nadab and Abihu who bring unauthorized fire into the tabernacle. They're innovating right away. They get too big for their britches. They're thinking, oh, I work here. Here's what I want to do. Here's what I feel like doing today. And it's very clear that like there is no tolerance for any kind of innovation. This is about strict adherence to protocol. So they don't have some kind of greater authority outside of the commands that God's given. And so it does turn our eyes to Moses as mediator. Maybe it turns our eyes to the role of the prophet in the Old Testament or the Tanakh as a whole. We shouldn't be relying on the priests who at every generation seem to be corrupt. We should be looking to the prophets who then critique the priesthood and call people back to accountability.
So yeah, you would say it's fitting into a larger theme in the Hebrew Bible that's not like anti-priesthood, but it is saying we need something more. Chastened
priesthood, maybe.
Chastened, yeah. It's just fascinating to think about. These scriptures are read and highly valued, say in the Second Temple period, where after the return from exile in Babylon, there are no other institutional authorities apart from the priests.
Yeah.
But this is their Bible.
And these are the stories they preserved and passed on, which is fascinating.
So fascinating. Yeah. It's sort of like, I'm trying to think of I never think of good parables on the spot, but a group that are the ones running the show, and the main story that we have to tell about our people is all about how the people who have had our job throughout history were total failures.
Well, it kind of makes me wonder whether there is this like scribal class that's separate from the priests who are actually preserving and passing on the stories. Like I'm thinking of Qumran, who felt like the priesthood was corrupt and they were going to be even more pure, and they're the ones collecting and passing on stories. So I don't know enough about textual transmission to feel confident, but it seems to me like somebody wanted us to see the failures of the priests for real.
I guess you could say the same. There's a lot of failed prophets too, and Moses being both successful at certain moments, and then he has his failures.
Are there a lot of failed prophets? Like we have the Moses moment in Numbers 20.
Yeah, I guess it depends on how you read the Elijah story. Currently, I am persuaded that he is a failed intercessor by his story on Mount Sinai. And let's see, what else? And then you have the weird prophet who gets deceived and eaten by a lion. That's
which is a parable. One. The whole thing. Not a parable in the sense that it didn't happen, but
it's a commentary. Yes.
I'm pretty persuaded by Peter Lightheart's reading of that story as like symbolizing the northern and southern kingdoms and their failure to follow the prophetic word.
Yeah, getting eaten by lions. So, and kings, of course, are both exalted, but as the royal seed of David, but also failures. So maybe this is part and parcel of how the Hebrew Bible works, is to say we need these figures, but at the same time, we just keep producing ones that fail.
So maybe we need Yahweh to rescue us. Yahweh to come shepherd us himself, because all of our shepherds are bad.
I think it's just, for me, it's the priests stand out because even the first priest is not, there are no good priests. There's just the description of the ideal.
Yeah.
But every human priest we meet ends up being a pretty miserable failure from the start of their stories. That is so fascinating to me.
Yeah. Aaron's a total pushover in Exodus 32. Everybody's pressuring him to make an idol, and he's like, well, okay, I guess I have to do this. Yeah. And then you can see him kind of trying to quickly rescue the moment by saying, hey, let's have a festival to Yahweh, as if that's going to somehow solve the problem. It is a very negative story.
Yeah. So maybe here, I'll make this a final question. And John, if you want to do any twists on it, feel free. And this is kind of going up and summarizing a theme from what we've been talking about. What is the significance of a story about the Sinai covenant, Israel and the law, that both the priest and the people fail in the very moment of its inception? And so thinking globally, because it's so, especially in depending on what Christian tradition you've been brought up in, you think, oh, the Old Testament, that is teaching people about the law. And now that Jesus has come, it's about grace and so on. So I know that you don't buy into any of that. And I've learned a lot from you about how to correct those things. But it just seems so significant that in the story about the inception of the introduction of the law to Israel, it's total failure from the start. What's the significance of that in the larger framework of the Hebrew Bible?
Yeah, good. I mean, I think anyone who's tried to do a Bible read through and they got to Exodus, the end of Exodus, and waded through 5 or 6 chapters of Tabernacle instructions would be able to tell you it's kind of a letdown to, you get some stories again in chapter 32 and 33, and then we're back into more Tabernacle instructions. Like we get all of the process of building the tabernacle takes as long to recount as the instructions. And it feels like, why is this in here twice? But I think in the literary design of Exodus, it's super important that the instructions came before the golden calf and that the implementation of those instructions came after it, because what it says to me is that Yahweh anticipated the need for forgiveness. He anticipated that these are sinful people and they're going to need a way to reconcile with me. And so before they even worship the golden calf, he was already designing a way to safely live in their neighborhood. And he was already putting into place what would need to happen so that they could be cleansed and the covenant would not be called off. This is one thing that persuades me with Mike Kibbe's thesis that when Moses is interceding in chapter 32, he's passing the test, that God was in fact giving him a test when he said, I will destroy you. That Moses passes the test by correctly discerning that he should mediate, not do away with these people. And so then when you have the building of the tabernacle, we get such detailed instructions, I think on purpose to mirror the instructions that Moses was given to show, okay, we're actually following God's plan now, and this time it's going to work. So these two things are framing the golden calf, which is where we see a total apostasy. And I think maybe important to note that it's not like God just kind of snaps his fingers and says, oh, okay, I'm not going to punish you then for that terrible thing you did, right? Like there's this moment of violence where the Levites run around killing the people who were involved in this terrible orgy, worship, whatever they're doing. There's a sense in which those who have participated in apostasy have to experience the consequences, but the rest of the community now has a path for cleansing. Like the residual effects of that sin are not going to hamper the covenant going forward because they have a tabernacle where those things can be dealt with, the sort of the sin of the community as a whole. So I think it illustrates both that God takes sin really seriously, but that he's very serious about forgiveness and about creating pathways for forgiveness for his people.
Those are great reflections. Yeah, I can't improve on those even. I think as we come to the conclusion of this conversation, that's good. Severe and strong commitment to justice on human evil, but just as equal, if not a greater. As James would say, mercy triumphs over judgment, commitment to creating pathways of forgiveness.
Yeah.
That's maybe not what most people would get after a first reading of Exodus. But those are really great reflections. Thanks for sharing those.
Yeah, thanks for your great questions.
Well, thank you, Carmen, for being on the podcast again and engaging with us more in Exodus and sharpening Tim, some pushback. It's wonderful. I did say it's overwhelming. I think it's also good for those following along to realize that there's a lot going on and not to just let us simplify things, but invite us into deeper engagement with these texts, which help us understand the character of God and our place in the story. I'm encouraged, though, that Jesus is our high priest and we can enter the throne room on the mountain. We could enter the fire on the mountain. So at least I know that to be true. And that is not less intimidating, I suppose.
Yeah.
But encouraging.
Maybe more intimidating, right? Like we're actually going to ascend the mountain. We're allowed to now.
Yeah. The trumpet's blasting. It's go time.
And we realize that we need to take it seriously.
That's true.
Yeah.
Don't carry the name in vain.
Right.
Yeah. Awesome. Yes. Thank you, Carmen. We wish you all the best. And I'm sure we will be talking again about the Bible at some point. So to be continued.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for having me, and thanks for all your work.
Okay, how's everyone doing? We did it. I'm sure you have no questions. Actually, speaking of questions, we are going to do a question and response for the Exodus scroll. It's going to be in a few weeks because we wanted to give enough time for questions to come in for these last few episodes. In the question and response, Tim and I are going to debrief this conversation. Tim's going to read the scholar that Carmen has cited, and we'll discuss his thoughts. But also, I want to talk with Tim about what to do when we find ourselves disagreeing fundamentally about the meaning of a biblical passage. So I look forward to that conversation in an upcoming Exodus Q&R. Next week, we're going to begin the scroll of Leviticus.
The Leviticus scroll begins first with that good danger kind of tension, but then chapters 1 through 7 of Leviticus are one long speech from God to Israel through Moses that are an invitation, a divine gift, telling the Israelites how they can approach the source of all life and beauty and power and goodness, even though they are frail and mortal and morally corrupt. But God wants them to come near. And so he gives them the gift of the Korban.
Today's episode was produced by...
Okay. So, and please listen to that whole, the links in the description to listen to this whole thing. How comfortable are you with tests? How comfortable are you with God testing? How comfortable are you with when you look at the individuals involved in Scripture that they are being tested constantly? And how comfortable are you that it's from God for his purpose? There was a continual point of, and it bothers me a little bit that failure, 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 failure. And I go, okay, let's put our story up on the silver screen and see, we're no different. You can't say, well, they are them and we are now. They're no different. We're not. However, can we strive to be the role that he wants us to be, taking the tests that we need to improve us, to make us stronger, better ambassadors, better priests for him? John mentioned something in the end. Again, I mentioned mishmashing the stories. And John says, I'm confident that God, that Yeshua, that Jesus is our high priest and that we can enter the throne room. And you go, it sounds pretty, but those are two totally different roles and stories. The high priest is here. The king is a throne room. There are no priests in a throne room. We mishmash our things sometimes. And I think that makes things convoluted. I think it muddies the waters. And I think we then create isms and things that we think about and do that challenge how we do it. And when we do that, we miss our priestly duties. And again, I will mention the brutal question that each of us asks is, are we failed intercessors, that priestly role as well? Are we? Point to ponder to end our day is a C.S. Lewis quote, which I like. What you see and what you hear depends a great deal on where you're standing. It also depends on what sort of person you are. Is that a character question? Is that a perception question? Is that a half empty, half full question? Interesting. Or quote from C.S. Lewis. And thanks for with us tonight on The Dusty Feet.